Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with veteran New York City Studio Vibraphonist, composer, and Mallet Keyboardist Steve Shapiro. He opened up about his new 2022 CD, Plan to Be Spontaneous, out on Solidtone Records. It's an album fueled by the events of the pandemic, and it's great that it's coming out right now. Over the years, he has recorded or performed with the likes of Steely Dan, Ornette Coleman, Phil Collins, Whitney Houston, They Might Be Giants, Pat Martino, and so many others. He is also quite an accomplished producer and arranger with work that has appeared in hundreds of high-profile projects for television, film, and Disney. He's got a great Pat Metheny story, and that seems to be the theme since Neon Jazz is actually coming out of his hometown of Lee Summit, Missouri. Enjoy this interview.
I've got helicopters flying by, and it's warm, so the windows are open.
I love it. It's fine. We can stage this as B-roll from Goodfellas, and then we'll be fine.
There you go. I'm like near the hospital. There must be tons going on because of the holiday weekend, but the copter, it's like the ambulance copter keeps coming by.
You know, when I used to live I'm here in Kansas City, and I used to live in Midtown in the city. I'm in the suburbs now. I had kids, and I moved away. But I remember when the weather got warm or near a holiday, it was a cacophony of sound all over the place.
Indeed, that is true. I'm not even in New York City. I'm out on the Cape.
Oh.
at present. But yes, indeed, I live slightly out of the city, too, because I needed to expand my studio to be large enough for vibes and marimbas and all the instruments I wanted, which started to become very difficult and expensive. I met Dave Samuels when I was a kid. Well, he used to have a nice loft, but that loft now is impossible for anyone but, someone extremely wealthy.
Absolutely. Well, I guess that's the thing. I guess that would be the starting point here of this kind of cacophony of human mingling right now, because we've been living through COVID. Things are finally easing up. Everybody's kind of getting back to some level of life as we knew it. So my question to you is, before we get into your new album, Plan to Be Spontaneous, which I guess is timely based on what's going on now, how did you survive COVID? What did you realize about yourself that's making you, hopefully, a stronger organism as we come out of it?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Well, the new album was totally inspired by it because, we all said, I think many of us, you just had to think about, well, what's really important to me? What am I wasting my time doing, and what is something that I should do and pursue, and what has, long-term effects that are positive. And then I started to realize, I've had all this music that I've been playing with various groups, and I knew I was thinking about making a record. And the other thing was what happened with COVID was I wanted to keep musicians busy. So to answer your question, it was, I think, to kind of help focus on what is more important, you know what I mean? Because it really gave us the opportunity to take a break from everything we were doing because things stopped happening, whether it was gigs or sessions or anything. So for example, on this new record, Jeff Coffin, the great saxophonist Jeff Coffin, who lives in Nashville, and is in Dave Matthews Band and worked with Snarky Puppy and all these people, who's a great guy. I've known him forever. And I said to myself, you know what, this is probably a good time to try to do something with Jeff because he's home. He's not on the road all the time. But now we're back to it, and he's out there. I don't know how to do a recording with him because his schedule is really full. That was what prompted the album, and it was all wrapped up in the pandemic, thoughts. And at the same time, we can go into it more, but what it did to the New York area and the jazz clubs that went out of business, 55 Bar, the Jazz Standard, it changed the landscape in New York. So we're still completely dealing with it, I think. But anyway, I think the new project was basically a reaction to what had happened, and a way to channel my energy and try to keep some musicians busy, give them some sessions so I knew weren't working.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing about all of this. As you said, as you touched on, there's been such a devastating angle on this with clubs that have closed and people that have been affected adversely, and, of course, people that lost their lives. But I think, too, when I see all you musicians coming out with music right now, it has to be a new dawn. There's an opportunity for you to play live. You have a new album coming out. It almost seems as though there's a level of Phoenix rebirth if we go into stuff like this right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've seen that too, and it's actually challenging now releasing this record this year because it turns out there's a huge amount of jazz releases this year, but I started to understand that I didn't quite think everyone was doing this because we were all so disconnected. You know, you used to see people at gigs and you would see what was up, and we were all disconnected wherever we were. And some New York musicians, a lot of New York musicians left the city. I mean, incredible people I know, like Joe Fromm, the saxophonist, moved to Nashville from New York, and he'd been in New York forever. Other people went out to the beach or something and got out of the city and now have returned. But we lost contact, so I didn't necessarily know what everyone was doing. But the point is that I think we should all expect that creative people need this creative outlet, and that during this time when you weren't hearing from everybody, they were all working on stuff. You know, if they were a creative person, they couldn't really stop doing that. That's kind of the way I felt. I felt like, well, we must channel this towards good. We have this energy. I had a bunch of tunes that I've been playing. I thought, I want to record these at some point. And then you just go, now's the time. Now I'm going to get these done. And so the interesting thing when it comes to this project was, you know, we all were Zooming and collaborating in new ways now. And a lot of us musicians have been doing that for a while. Like in the commercial world, I was always, you know, sending tracks back and forth to people or to clients over the internet. That's been going on for a long time. But the whole world kind of went to Zoom. And so I started to feel like, you know, which gets into the theme of plan to be spontaneous, because that was kind of what we were doing. And was this remote collaboration idea made me say that I have no barriers. In other words, there's no excuse not to do this now in this pandemic. You want to get these songs recorded, let's do it. Like Shane Perio, a guitarist who played on the project, who's the music director of Hall & Oates, a great guitar player, played the Neville Brothers. And usually Shane was living in New Orleans. He came to New York for a while, and actually that we had played a lot then, and I wanted to capture that band, which was the band with Joe Rosenblatt and Mark Egan. But at the time, during the pandemic, Shane was in LA. No problem. I said, I'm going to send you the tracks and you send me your stuff back. And we collaborated remotely like that. Because you know what? I figured this is what everyone's doing. What else can we do? Right? In other words, that was part of the challenge of the project. Like, how can this is the world of what we're all doing now. We can't get together. How can we do this as good as possible? Make that really work. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So let's go back to the beginnings of your life. Are you originally from New York?
No, I'm originally from Connecticut, and I came out of a place where a lot of musicians came from.
So how did it all begin family-wise, like growing up? Was it always your destiny to be a musician?
Not necessarily, but a couple things drew me to it. So I came out of, I grew up in West Hartford, Connecticut, where during the 70s and 80s, we had the #1 high school jazz band in the country. And it's still a really good public school, high school jazz program. So out of my high school came, I graduated with Peter Mcginnis, who's a great arranger now at William Patterson College as a professor of arranging. He's an incredible trombonist and singer. He's in the group, the Royal Bobsters now. And then out of my high school, a few years later, came Brad Meldau, came Joel Fromm, Richie Barchet. There's all these really amazing musicians. You know, it was mostly because that environment, our parents were all like professionals and said, well, you guys can pursue it. You know, go pursue what you like. And we had this high school jazz program where we had a director who was very intense and was able to get this band shipshape so that we won all these awards and stuff. But for me, I started on drums, and it was a little bit like a Whiplash, like the movie Whiplash. It was a little bit like that, a lot of intimidation, and I found it to be, I think the band was good because there was a lot of intimidating the kids to go practice who weren't really serious musicians. But for those of us who were serious musicians, I didn't like that there was that, like, since I've taught as an adult now, I prefer the inspiration route. So where I actually found inspiration was during this time, I got involved with a place in Connecticut, in Wethersfield, not far away. This guy named Bob Gatson, who became my first vibes teacher. And Bob had come out of Berkeley with Pat Metheny, and he had studied with Gary Burton. And Bob introduced me to this whole world of music that was happening in the late 70s between New York and Boston. So he would bring Pat Metheny to his shop to do clinics, and I would be 16 years old, and he would have me work the door for tickets and hang out with Pat after. That had the biggest impact. Now, with the high school group, we got to tour Europe. We got to do incredible things. We came to New York City and recorded at RCA Studios in the same room as Frank Sinatra. There was great opportunities. I had real fun with my high school friends doing that. Meanwhile, I had this other thing going on because Creative Music was a percussion shop. It was drums and percussion. And by the time I was a senior in high school, Bob had been a vibes player. He switched back to drums, and he made me the vibes teacher at Creative Music. But through Bob and through that scene, I was introduced to Dave Samuels, who became my mentor and good friend. And I was introduced to people like Steve Swallow, and I studied drums with Bob Moses, which I described actually at the time as being like throwing a puppy into the ocean and trying to get it to swim. But that was my background, which I feel very grateful for growing up, because that really, turned me on to the whole music scene and all these people who are incredible people and musicians. I mean, like, Samuels and Steve Swallow, they're just some of the greatest people I ever met, I had all of it going on. I was fortunate. I had the thing happening in school, and I had this other scene of really great people who are older than me. They're all like 10 years older than me, but took me under their wing, And then when I arrived in New York, that kept happening with new people, which also I'm grateful for. But that early chapter, our little town was a good springboard for some musicians to come out of. Like I said, Brad and everybody had a similar experience,
So over the years, you've performed with a lot of really heavy cats and bands, Steely Dan, Ornette Coleman, Phil Collins, They Might Be Giants, Pat Martino. My question to you is, what did you learn from them that in turn has made you, that you teach younger players that you're around? What did you get from them?
It's interesting. I got different things from each of them, but really valuable things, of course. There's nothing better that you can do in music or in jazz than just get around some of these people who are kind of legendary, and you pretty soon figure out exactly what it is that makes them so great. It's pretty simple. I try to teach that. Sometimes it's hard to just. It's so specific in each of what, like the people you just mentioned, what I thought their big lessons were. Usually when you're teaching, like for example, I was teaching a course at Yale a number of times where it was more oriented toward my work in film and television music and being a film composer. And there we talked about lessons of copyright and learning your worth. But for those jazz musicians and the other musicians we talked about, Ornette, somebody like that, I mean, his just whole way of looking at the world and looking at music, if you just spending a little time with him and seeing what like an open person he is, and that you kind of understand how he could reinvent the saxophone. And I actually got to ask him some specific questions about harmonics, which was his harmonic language. I never quite understood it, and I never quite understood, like, how could I apply that to the vibraphone? And he just stood there and explained it to me very simply, and I was like, oh, now I get it, But it's all coming with Ornette from this just place of openness, just like, he's just incredible, warm person, and puts all of that into the music. And then you go with someone like Phil Collins, and the lesson, working with him, he was just methodically great about making sure every track was perfect, every vocal thing he did was perfect, and he wouldn't settle for something that he didn't think had been his very best take and all that. And of course, every one of them sounded amazing. You're listening to this, and I'm saying nobody sounds like this as a singer. So I'm saying, I think with these individuals, you take away these little specific things that can all add up, and I try to explain it just like I did to you now, to students. It's very far away from if you're talking about, the language of playing bebop on the vibraphone, to start talking about this, you know what I mean? But I'll give you an example. Like, I always tell vibraphonists and vibraphone students, one of the first things that Ornette said to me, so you're a vibraphonist, and you must have to lead your own gigs. And I was like, Yeah, that's exactly right. That's what you have to do as a vibraphonist. The sideman opportunities just come around every once in a while, but you really have to, if you want to get yourself out there, you got to become a band leader too. And he just cut right through to that, you know, and he made me feel like, oh, he understood that's part of what it is in some ways to be a vibist, you know. And I try to transfer that kind of information that I got, you know, because I feel like that's helpful for young players to realize, yeah, you're going to be dragging around this instrument and you're going to have to lead the gigs, and you better love playing the vibes because, you know, it's otherwise, why are you doing that?
You know, the interesting thing, and I'm biased, totally biased, but I love the vibes. I always have had like a leaning on my show towards the sound of the vibes and playing the music. And I'm wondering, as a veteran of the instrument, explain to me something about the vibes that your layperson, your regular listener doesn't understand about the instrument.
That's interesting. Well, there's a joke that Gary Burton used to say, like, yeah, someone said, when you start going really fast, it almost looks like you're using 4 mallets. People don't know it's a joke because you are using 4 mallets. But that is, you know, the kind of technique that developed mid-century that Gary Burton kind of pioneered, which was to play the instrument in more of a pianistic fashion. So at the most rudimentary level that I think most musicians understand is there's a couple of ways to approach it. That you have the Lionel Hampton started out, and it was a very percussive, swingy type of thing that Lionel did. But when you got to Milt Jackson, all of a sudden Milt started to be able to play the vibraphone like a horn, you know, taking his phrasing from horn players, Lester Young or whatever. And then as you, got to, I think, Bobby Hutcherson, there's a little of that horn. And Bobby Hutcherson, I think of as more bringing the sheets of sound like John Coltrane could do. He brought that to the vibes. And then you have Gary Burton and Victor Feldman, who I take as that's my lineage on the vibraphone, is, you know, Gary Burton, seeing him changed my life, and I think many of the things he did musically were really reached out to me as a younger musician. And he approached the instrument like a piano, just like Victor Feldman. And then I studied with Dave Samuels and David Friedman, who kind of came out of that school. And I think one thing in the particular pianistic approach people don't understand, and I will tell you that, you know, maybe the living master of this is David Friedman, because David Samuels is no longer with us, unfortunately. But Dave Samuels was a master as well with this, which is the idea of dampening on the vibes, which is what you're doing is you have the pedal so the notes can ring, but you are also using the mallets to dampen the bars. And by doing that, it's hard to explain this without demonstrating it to you on the instrument. But what happens is, as you phrase a line, if you use the mallets to dampen the bars, you can achieve a really nice legato that you can't in any other way on the instrument using the pedal. So what you can do, and like if you watch David Friedman, I try to do this. If you see me, you're playing and ringing some of the instrument. This would be maybe more, you'd hear this more in like a solo setting, but it applies to always playing in any format. But when you're solo setting, you can ring the instrument part of it and use this technique to create a line over that and make the line have its own independent phrasing. Now, if you're on a piano, you don't have to worry about this because you have the ability to hold down the chord and then play short notes with your right hand, you know. But you don't have that ability on the vibes because you can't hold the chord down. You can only let it ring with the pedal. I don't know if I got too technical, but this idea of dampening and that technique on the instrument, I don't think most people understand that some vibes are playing that way, but it really changes the ability of the instrument to be an expressive jazz, you know, vehicle.
No, that makes total sense. Absolutely. You know, and the one thing about COVID is that, you know, there was kind of this longing and missing of going out and doing live shows and whatnot. And I'm curious, in that moment of reflection, you know, what is it that you like the best about being a professional musician?
That's an interesting question. Well, I mean, that's changed a lot. I would definitely say that it continues to change in some ways in terms of what the business is, because the business has changed. So some of the things I used to enjoy doing, like, for example, I mean, I'll just answer your question simply. It's a clear answer to me, which is the community and the people and the wonderful hang with musicians, you know, and when you can make that hang happen musically. It's usually also happen off the bandstand, but I'll say, like, so for example, I got into doing sessions and jingles and commercials and things because I could be in the studio. I mean, a few times when I started out, I had Michael Brecker on sessions, and it was all these incredible people that I worked with every single day back when the New York session scene was, people doing 3 jingles a day during the day, and then at night you'd see everyone in the jazz clubs. So that is no longer happening. There's no session scene like that. It's still that, my thing I like best is the people, but I used to say, I didn't mind doing a commercial project because I got to work with these great musicians. And now commercial projects, you're sitting there by yourself in front of a computer. And that's also a double-edged feeling for me. I mean, I still love the technology, but I don't love sitting in front of the computer cranking out a piece of television with no musicians. That's much less fun than it used to be. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. What was the first live jazz show that you ever saw that really blew you away?
I think the one that really made the biggest impression was when I was in that high school band. There was a great jazz society in Hartford, the Hartford Jazz Society. They probably still exist, but they were going really strong in the late 70s. And a friend of mine's dad took me to see a Gary Burton quartet. And I think it was the band. With Tiger Akoshi on trumpet, and it might have been Danny Gottlieb on drums, and it was Steve Swallow on bass. And just seeing that quartet and like actually seeing it live, I think I'd heard a little Gary Burton, but when I actually saw like what happened in that band and how that worked, it just grabbed me. Little did I know how hard it would ever be to play the vibraphone like that, because Gary is just this one-of-a-kind genius. That definitely made me feel like, and even though I loved Milt Jackson and all that, I felt like Milt was the vibist or a musician of like my parents' generation. And I dug it and it was swinging, but it didn't make me feel like this is what's happening now. And when I saw Gary, I was like, this is what's happening now, and that kept going on because as Pat Metheny came out of that band and did his own thing, I kept feeling like that's what's happening, and it was, you look back and those are the people changing the music, at that time. So that's always stuck with me. And again, to circle back to my project, the whole thing about my project was, I don't want you to put this album on and be like, oh yeah, it sounds like another Vibes player. It sounds like something I heard before. I think for people who like the vibraphone, they'll be like, oh, I've never really heard a project like this before. And that's always what I enjoyed, about discovering like Gary's music. It didn't sound like anybody else's, and it also sounded like what was happening, if it was 1978 or 1984, that's what it felt like was happening then, Didn't feel like that jazz, the history, the music of the past, even though we all have to learn and appreciate that music as the foundation of whatever we do,
Before everything shut down in the world, I'm in the Kansas City area, I moved to Lee Summit, which is the home of Pat Metheny. I always like to ask people, do you have a good Pat Metheny story? Because ever since that happened and I mentioned Lee Summit and Pat's name comes up, I get amazing stories from everybody.
Yeah, it's funny. I do. He was really instrumental in inspiring me to want to be a musician because he was just completely happening at the time. Happening in terms of like this little germ that became much bigger. So I always felt like, oh man, I was in on this early. I felt like it was some secret I knew because I had met him when he just had left Gary's band and, he wasn't that famous or anything, but he was still, it was the early days of the Pat Metheny group and he was, we can also talk about the fact that Mark Egan, who was part of that band, is on my project, is on Plan to Be Spontaneous. There's certainly a direct link to my love for that early Pat Metheny group and why I've always loved Mark's playing and why, of course, I wanted to work with him because just what he always brought to that music I thought was tremendous. And Danny Gottlieb, too, Danny was on my record that came out in 2000 called Xylophobia. I had Danny Gottlieb and Mark Johnson as the rhythm section on that. But they, those guys were integral in that band. And also then Lyle Mays became this like since I'm a kind of keyboard and synthesizer guy, he became one of my big heroes along with Joe Zawinul. Anyway, the thing about my Pat story, so they were playing at Hartford Jazz Festival, which was this big outdoor venue, big on Bushnell Park in Hartford, and my friend Bob Gaston, who I had mentioned, was opening up with his band. So Bob had me backstage, and I don't know, I must have been 17 and maybe Pat was 27, but Pat took the time to really talk to me. Like, he talked to me, he looked me in the eye, really had a great conversation with me. He told me all about how when he had played vibes, I didn't realize he had been a vibes player. He wanted to be in Gary Burton's band. I guess he played vibes for a while, and then he wanted to be in Gary's band and realized he never could as a vibes player. And I think he also saw how difficult the vibes would be to do what he wanted to do. So thankfully for all of us, he switched to guitar. But he was telling me about, how, you pull the callus off your finger when you play the vibes, when you're trying to play really hard. I'm like, yes, I know, that's what happens to all of us. So he just impressed me because he had really no reason that he needed to spend some time talking to a 16-year-old, and he was super nice. But I will say at the same time, anytime I've been in a situation with him, I can't even get to see him. He's always backstage or something. I haven't ever really talked to him since, But he did give me that real nice attention at just the right age, that it inspired me for a really long time, especially watching what his career did from there, and say, wow, he was really nice when I met him. So I will say, back to your lessons, I really try to do that with young musicians and always be nice, at least be nice to them, because I also had a fair amount of musicians that weren't that nice. More you'd meet them in the New York session world and they would be like, oh, who are you, young guy, But the guys, who the nicest guys in that world were? Michael Brecker and Will Lee, who's still a great bass player, Will Lee. Those guys, welcomed me and were so nice, and it makes you think, that's the musician I want to be, like those guys. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've always heard that about Pat. I've heard people lauding him for how gracious he was at his time. Now that we're getting back to it, the world's kind of opening up, live music's picking back up. What do you hope we all realize about the power of live music?
Wow. This was another thing that I thought about with making the record, but it's more about, for me, doesn't apply to making a studio record as much as the live gigs, right? Is that live music, when you're there, it's one thing to play with your friends or co-musicians, but when you have an audience, what's really happening, I think that I found this, what's the inspiring concerts I've seen over my life. The real thing is that you're all experiencing this moment together. Like, so if the band's good or the band's bad, whatever's happening, you experience this moment together. And the one thing that happens in jazz that can't really happen in concert music, when there's all the music written on the page, is that sometimes the musicians don't know what's going to happen. I mean, usually at the best gigs, the musicians don't know exactly what's going to happen. And that keeps an excitement there, And if the audience is there, too, with you on that excitement, I've definitely been kind of trying to say this at gigs. Like, here we are, all in the moment. We don't know what's going to happen. We hope we make it through this tune that we maybe didn't rehearse enough, and it's got some really tricky parts. And hey, give us a break if we don't. You're here with us, and we're going to all give this a try, and hopefully you're gonna like being on the ride. I think that, to me, what we should focus on more, especially with jazz, post pandemic, this idea that we're all on this kind of journey together, and you could be that way on going to the symphony, but when the music's all written, it's a little bit different journey. You know what I mean? They can't just take it in any direction at any time. And what I love about jazz is that you can take it in any direction at any time. If the musicians are good enough playing together and following each other.
So everyone has a perception of you, an idea of who they think you are. Your family, your friends, your fans, but ultimately you live your life. You have a perception of you. Who do you think you are?
Oh my God. That's 25 layers deep. That's an interesting thing. Well, I don't know. I'm kind of and I could use the word adaptable, or I could use the word not sure, like a morphing type of guy. But I think some of that is out of necessity. I mean, being a vibes player, I think to be successful in music, you have to be able to wear a lot of hats and have a lot of pots on the fire, maybe not just playing the instrument. So who I am is someone that can kind of move between formats and styles and whatever. And by that I mean my true musical personality, I think, in the music that I want to write as music I would think that would be interesting for people to listen to and experience as someone who's an artist is focused around the vibes, is focused around technology, applying the vibes technology, but also I still do television and film work as a composer, as an arranger, and in those things I also move between styles. Like what I enjoy about doing that is one day I can write a country piece, another day I can write a classical piece, the next day I write a jazz piece or a techno piece. So I think for me it's to be someone who, I don't want to say like a jack of all trades, master of none. It's not that, because I have my focus on the vibes, but I do think it's to be maybe the best way to put it is to be a very well-rounded and well-experienced musician, and see myself like that, and try to also, this is as far as the teaching and handing down this idea, I think in our modern world here, it wasn't just the pandemic, but it was the tech companies and it was everything else that's been happening in the world, that musicians need to be this. They need to be able to morph between styles, between genres, between commercial and artistic. I think it's going to be a necessary way for everyone to go towards the future. You know, I just don't think you're going to be able to say I'm a one-dimensional vibraphonist and I'm going to get enough work and enough things happening. I mean, if you can, God bless you. But you know, I think this idea of being diversified and well-rounded, I mean, I suppose that's the way I would hope to be perceived in some ways, you know.
Steve, hey, man, thank you for taking some time out today, man. I really appreciate it.
That was great to talk to you, Joe. Thanks for the call.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest players and minds in New York, Kansas City, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. Thanks to Steve for his time, music, and story. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino in the iTunes Store. Visit Neon Jazz at YouTube, or you can go to the neonjazz.blogspot.com and go to joedomino.com if you feel like kicking in via Patreon or PayPal. Until next time, enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.